The wind cut through the bone, like truth, quiet, biting, and uninvited. James Brant sat hunched in the wagon seat, his broad shoulders wrapped in a wool coat that had faded along with much of his life. The trail behind him was a frozen scar across the prairie, traced by the iron rims of his wheels and the ghost of his intentions. He wasn't heading anywhere in particular, not really. Just to town, just to feed, just to survive another day, where the only voices in his cabin were the wind in the rafters and the memory of a laugh he hadn't heard in 3 winters. His horse, a tired bay gelding with ribs like bent slats under skin, wheezed in the cold as they clattered down the main street of Sundown Ridge. The buildings were shuttered tight, glass winking with frost, smoke curling thin and tired from chimneys. The town wasn't dead, but it had the look of something trying not to breathe too loud. James liked that. The quiet. The way people didn't ask questions anymore. He pulled up near the mercantile, boots hitting hard-packed snow with a crack. He patted the horse's neck, then stepped to the back of the wagon to check the sacks he'd bartered last week. Beans, coffee, and salt. Just enough to get by. He reached for the tarp. It moved. He froze. Not the wind. Not an animal. A shift, human. He heard it then, a shallow breath, the tremble of cotton skirts brushing wood, the rustle of someone trying not to be found. James didn't speak, just stared, one hand still on the tarp, the other drifting to the knife at his belt. Not fast, not threatening. Careful. He eased the canvas back. She was curled beneath an old quilt he didn't recognize. Knees to her chest, boots nearly worn through, a bonnet half crushed beneath her head. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, lips pale but chapped from travel. She couldn't have been much over 20, but it was hard to tell. Grime and exhaustion blurred the edges of youth. Her eyes snapped open, hazel, startled, familiar with fear. She scrambled halfway up, tangled in the quilt, voice rough and dry. Frank. James didn't answer. He didn't know who Frank was. He didn't know what this woman was doing asleep in his wagon. But he saw the way her fingers clenched around a folded piece of paper, creased, damp, clutched like scripture. "You're not," she began, then stopped. Looked around. Realized what she'd done. I thought this was. He held up a hand. "Don't matter." His voice was low, worn smooth. "You hungry?" She blinked, swallowed, nodded. He passed her a strip of jerky from his coat pocket, still wrapped in wax paper. She took it like a person not used to being offered things. Bit slow, chewed slower. Eyes never left him. "I don't want trouble," she said after a moment. Her voice was soft, careful, threaded with something she hadn't learned to trust. "I just needed somewhere warm. I was walking. Then I couldn't." James nodded once. "You walked far." She looked down. Far enough. The jerky was gone. Her hand still hovered near her mouth, like she didn't want to let go of it. "You runnin'?" he asked. Not sharply. Just the way you'd ask the time. She didn't answer. Not with words. Just looked at the paper in her hand, then tucked it into her bodice like something sacred. James studied her. Not with judgment. Just the way he looked at weather. What was coming. What it might take with it. He reached behind the bench and pulled out a heavier quilt. One his wife had sewn in the first year of their marriage, back when colors meant something. He handed it down. She took it in silence. "You can ride back with me," he said, almost as an afterthought. "If you want." The woman hesitated, then nodded. James climbed back into the seat, cracked the reins, and turned the wagon toward the edge of town. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from, or who Frank was, or what she meant by couldn't. He didn't need to. She was running from something, maybe someone. So was he, in his own way. The sun dropped lower, shadows stretching long across the land. The snow had softened but not melted, and the trees stood bare as bones. When they reached the cabin, set back from the trail, half sunk into a hillside like it didn't want to be seen, he stepped down and led the horse to the lean-to. She followed, the quilt around her shoulders like a worn shawl. Didn't ask what place this was, or who it belonged to. Maybe she knew it didn't matter. Inside, the cabin held the smell of dry wood, coffee grounds, and dust. A kettle sat on the iron stove. A single chair by the hearth. 2 boots near the door, 1 pair too small for any man, untouched in months. James lit the lamp. She stood in the doorway, hesitant. "You can take the cot," he said, gesturing to the far wall. "I'll stay near the stove." She nodded, then walked slow toward the cot. Her knees buckled a little when she reached it, but she caught herself. "I'm Olivia," she murmured, without turning. He paused, then said, "James." That was all. He poured water from the kettle into a tin cup and set it on the small table between them. She looked at it like it was too much. Outside, the wind started up again, low and steady. The dog, old, brindled, and nearly deaf, wandered in from the shed and laid down by the stove, not even pausing to sniff the stranger. James sat in the chair, the fire crackling behind him. He took out a small tin from his coat pocket. Inside, a lock of hair, a button, and a folded drawing done in crayon. He didn't open it, just held the tin like a weight he'd grown used to carrying. Olivia turned on the cot, facing the wall. She didn't ask who the drawing belonged to. She didn't need to. In the stillness, time passed like water under ice, slow, inevitable, unnoticed until it cracked. Later that night, when James lay down on the floor, he noticed something. Her boots had been placed side by side, neatly, by the cot. She hadn't just dropped them. She'd been taught to be careful, maybe punished if she wasn't. He closed his eyes. He didn't know why he hadn't sent her away. Maybe it was the way she looked at the cup before taking it. Maybe it was how she never once asked for anything. Maybe it was just the season, and the way winter made everything feel like it might not survive another night. He heard her breathing, soft now, even. And something else. A humming, barely there. A lullaby maybe, off-key, but full of some memory she hadn't yet buried. James didn't move. The fire dimmed. In the dark, 2 strangers lay under different roofs of sorrow. One fresh, one worn smooth, but for the first time in a long while, neither of them was alone. And outside, the snow began again. Morning came slow, with a sky the color of ash and air sharp enough to sting the lungs. The world outside the cabin lay hushed in snow, but inside something shifted, not loudly, not even visibly, just enough to be felt. Olivia rose before James did. She moved like someone afraid to wake a sleeping house, each step measured, every drawer opened with care. The kettle hissed before the fire caught fully. She kept her back to him while he stirred beneath his blanket, watching from the corner of one eye as she folded her quilt, smoothed her skirts, and began slicing what remained of a winter apple. James didn't speak until she passed him a tin cup of water. "You slept," he said. She nodded. "Better than I expected." He didn't say it, but he had to. They ate quietly, bread hard from the cold, apple thinly sliced between them. The silence wasn't uneasy. It was the kind that forms between people who've learned not to fill space with noise. She moved around the cabin like she'd lived there once before, in another life maybe. She swept ashes into the pail, folded the cot blanket again after rising, checked the window seams for drafts. James watched her, not with suspicion, but with a slow study of someone remembering what it meant to share time. Later, he offered her a pair of boots from the back of the cupboard, his late wife's, worn at the heel but lined with fleece. Olivia took them with quiet hands, brushing her thumb once over the stitching. "They fit," she said, "though they look too snug." James nodded. Didn't expect they'd get worn again. She didn't ask whose they'd been. She didn't need to. Days passed like that, not marked by any clock, but by repetition, chores, meals, light shifting across the floorboards. James would head out at dawn to feed the horse and check the fence line. Olivia would stay behind, minding the fire, kneading dough she managed to coax from flour and lard, patching a torn seam in one of his shirts with thread she found tucked in a drawer beside old receipts and brittle paper valentines. She never asked to stay, and he never asked her to leave. They didn't speak much, but in the small gestures, him brushing snow from the porch before she stepped out, her setting his cup where she knew he liked it, something unspoken gathered between them, like warmth in the walls. She began to hum when she worked. Nothing loud, just small, wandering tunes, half remembered. It made the space feel fuller. One morning, he returned from the barn to find her seated by the stove, needle in hand, mending a leather glove that hadn't fit right since his second winter alone. Her hair was down, plait half undone, wisps curling near her cheek from the steam of the kettle. "You don't need to fix everything," he said gently. She smiled without looking up. "Maybe not, but it helps." That day, the dog returned to her side. He'd taken to lying near her feet, and when she bent to rub behind his ear, James saw something settle in the animal's posture. A trust earned, not given. In the barn, tucked high in the rafters, Olivia found a child's toy horse. Wooden, carved by hand. The tail was missing, and one wheel had split, but she didn't ask whose it had been. She set it on the mantel like it belonged there, like it always had. James noticed it the next evening. He didn't touch it, didn't speak of it, just stared for a long moment before sitting down and lighting his pipe. That night, a storm rolled in. Not thunder, just snow, soft but insistent, blanketing everything in slow erasure. They watched from the window. James with his arms crossed, Olivia wrapped in the old quilt again. Her fingers gripped the edges tighter than the cold required. He spoke then. "First time in a long while. I buried them out back. Wife and daughter. Pneumonia took 'em. Winter like this one." Olivia said nothing, just stood still beside him. He turned slightly. "You." She exhaled, a breath she'd been holding for years. "I was promised to a man who liked the sound of his own boots more than the sound of my voice. Told me I'd be safe. Gave me a letter to prove it. Then changed." James didn't ask how. He didn't need to. He saw it in the way she flinched when doors slammed, in the way she avoided looking at herself too long in the mirror. "You left him?" She nodded once. "When I figured I could either die slow there or risk dying fast on the road." They stood in the silence that followed. Not empty silence, waited. A recognition. The next day, Olivia ventured out with him to the creek, her shawl tied tight under her chin. The path was slippery, but she didn't ask for help. He didn't offer, just walked beside her, the way some men walk behind coffins, reverent, steady, full of silent respect. She spoke as they reached the edge. "You always live like this?" James looked out at the frost-bitten brush, at the trees standing bare like they were waiting for something to come back. "Not always. Used to think I was a husband, a father. Then I just became a man with a name." Olivia's breath clouded before her. "You still are." He looked at her, really looked, not with pity, with something like memory. They returned in silence, and something about the walk seemed to stitch their silences closer together, like fabric finally meeting its seam. That evening, she brought out a half-finished quilt she found folded beneath a cedar chest. The pattern was off, one square unmatched, the thread different from the rest. She ran her fingers over it gently. "Yours?" she asked. He shook his head. "Hers." She never got to finish. Olivia set it on her lap. "Maybe I could." He didn't respond, but when he reached for his pipe, his hands trembled slightly. The dog shifted closer to the fire. The cabin breathed with them. Later, as the wind rose outside and the fire burned low, Olivia placed a small tin box on the table. James recognized it. One of his. Forgotten. Inside, she had tucked the wooden horse, the first patch of the finished quilt, and the drawing she'd found tucked in the locket he never opened. "You're not the only one carrying things," she said, voice like soft rain. "Sometimes it helps to set them down. Just for a while." James stared at the box, then at her, then nodded. Outside, the storm didn't let up, but inside, something different settled. She moved toward the cot, he toward the chair. Before she lay down, she turned. "James." He looked up. "I'm not trying to stay. Not unless there's room for more than just surviving." He held her gaze, then rose, walked to the hearth, picked up the quilt square she'd sewn. "There might be," he said, voice thick, "if you want." She nodded once, then turned away. In the dark, the wind howled, but neither of them heard it as loud anymore. The cabin, worn and tired as it was, felt less like a grave and more like a shelter. And for the first time in a long while, the night passed without either of them wishing it away. The snow had crusted over by morning, hard and brittle beneath James's boots. He hitched the wagon with practiced ease, though his shoulder ached from the weight of a life done mostly alone. Olivia watched from the porch, arms crossed, her shawl wrapped tight against a wind that no longer seemed to surprise her. She didn't ask where he was headed, just met his eyes for a long moment, then nodded. He didn't say when he'd be back. He never did. But she always kept the coffee warm until the door opened again. Sundown Ridge looked different in daylight. The snow flattened its flaws, hiding broken window panes and weather-rotted signs beneath a sheet of white. The mercantile's bell rang sharp as James entered, boots thudding on the warped wood. He nodded to the clerk, dropped a list on the counter, and moved toward the back, where feed was kept in thick burlap sacks and molasses was stored in jars the color of blood amber. He was reaching for one when the voice stopped him, smooth, polished, with just enough rust under the shine to make a man listen closely. "Pardon me," the stranger said. "I'm looking for someone." James didn't turn immediately, just kept his hand on the jar, breathing slow. The man was well-dressed, but not too well. He wore trailed dust like a costume, a long coat, fur-lined gloves, a hat that hadn't seen honest weather. His boots were new, clean, too clean. That alone made James distrust him. "I was told there's a woman, young, travels alone, might have come through here," the man continued, answering to the name Olivia May. James didn't flinch, not outwardly, but something in his chest shifted, slow and heavy. He straightened, jar in hand, and turned. "Name's Frank Talbot," the man offered, extending a gloved hand. James didn't take it. "Don't know her." Talbot smiled. "Pity. She's my fiancé. Ran off before the wedding. Left me with a preacher and a lot of questions." There was something behind the man's eyes, something too still, like a snake in a hollow log. James knew the type. All charm until something slipped. "She's a small thing," Talbot went on, as if painting a picture. "Dark hair. Wears that uncertainty like perfume. Makes a man want to save her, you know." James said nothing. "She's got a letter on her," Talbot added. "Signed by me. Legal arrangement. Not quite marriage, but close enough by God's standards. Surely you'd remember a girl like that." I said I didn't. A pause stretched between them. Talbot smiled again, softer now, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he said, tucking his gloves back into his coat, "if you happen to see her, let her know I've been patient. And I'd appreciate it if she came back on her own." James didn't speak as Talbot walked out, the bell above the door ringing behind him. He finished loading the wagon in silence. His hands moved as they always did, methodical, steady, but his mind had already ridden home ahead of him. Olivia met him at the door when he returned, snow up to her ankles, hair tucked behind her ears. Her expression shifted the moment she saw his face. Not fear, but knowing. "He's here," she said quietly. James gave a slow nod. They didn't speak of it that night. She stirred stew with a ladle handle worn smooth by years of hands that weren't hers. He chopped firewood until his muscles throbbed. They moved around each other like people in the same storm, both waiting for the thunder. It came the next morning. Olivia was hanging wet linens by the stove, steam rising from the fabric like breath, when the knock sounded. Not frantic, not urgent, just entitled. James opened the door. Talbot stood there, hat in hand, smiling like a man greeting old friends. His coat gleamed, and his horse behind him was sleek and black, steam curling from its nostrils. "Hope I'm not intruding," he said, already stepping forward. James blocked the entrance with his body. "You are." Talbot looked past him. "Olivia." Her name hung in the air like something fragile. She stepped into view, still holding the wet cloth. Her face was unreadable. "There you are," Talbot said, like finding a misplaced glove. "I've come to take you home." Olivia didn't move. "You left in a hurry," he continued. "Didn't even pack your things. I figured you'd cooled off and just needed a little time." Still, she said nothing. James didn't step aside. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't choose." Talbot turned his attention back to him, the smile dimming. "I don't believe I introduced myself properly. Frank Talbot, banker, landowner, and most importantly, her betrothed." No law says a woman has to return to a man just 'cause he says she should. There's a contract, Talbot said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a folded paper. Signed, witnessed, paid for. She's not property. She's mine, Talbot snapped, then caught himself. Smoothed his tone. By law and arrangement. And you're harboring her. Could get yourself into trouble for that. James looked at Olivia. Her hands were trembling slightly, still gripping the cloth. Do you want to go with him? He asked, voice low. Olivia didn't answer right away. She stared at Talbot, then at the floor, then finally up into James's face. No, she said, just above a whisper. Talbot's jaw tightened. I'm afraid that's not up to you, sweetheart, he said, stepping forward. We had an agreement. And you've cost me reputation, money, time. You're coming back. James's hand went to the hammer loop on his belt. He didn't draw. Didn't need to. She said no. Talbot's mouth twisted. You think this place changes anything? You think playing house with some broken-down farmer makes you clean? Olivia flinched, but didn't back away. She stepped closer to James, not behind him. I'm not yours, she said, voice steadier now. I never was. Talbot looked between them, something turning in his eyes. Contempt, confusion, disbelief. You'll regret this, he said finally. Both of you. He turned, walked out. The door closed behind him like a lid on something rotting. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Olivia dropped the cloth. James exhaled. You all right? He asked. She nodded. I think so. The fire crackled behind them. Later, she sat by the window, watching Talbot's silhouette disappear into the trees. Her face was pale, but her spine didn't curl like it used to. She held a cup of coffee in both hands, steam rising between her lips as she breathed it in like something holy. James didn't press her, just sat across from her in his usual chair, carving a new handle for the kettle hook. His hands moved slowly, shaving curls from the wood, the rhythm steady and grounding. The dog lay between them. Outside, snow fell again. That night, neither of them slept much. But neither of them were alone either. In the early hours, Olivia stood barefoot by the hearth. She held the paper Talbot had left, reading it one last time before feeding it to the flames. The ink curled and vanished into black. James watched her from a chair. She didn't know he was awake. When she turned, she caught his eye. Do you believe in beginnings? She asked softly. He thought about it for a long moment. I believe in choosing, he said. And sometimes that looks like starting over. She nodded. Then she crossed the room, took his hand, and sat with him until the fire burned down low. There were no promises spoken, no grand alleviations, just warmth, just presence, just the slow, quiet truth of two people no longer trying to escape their pasts, but letting the other stand beside them in it. And somewhere out in the dark, the echo of Talbot's boots faded completely. The storm rolled in overnight. By morning, the world beyond the cabin had vanished beneath a curtain of white. Snowflakes clung to the window panes in thick clusters, muting the light and softening the edges of everything. Inside, the fire burned low, casting shadows that danced across Olivia's face as she sat wrapped in the patchwork quilt, mending a torn seam in one of James's shirts. Her fingers moved steadily, but her thoughts were elsewhere. James stood by the door, staring out into the shapeless drift. He'd known the storm was coming. The signs had been there, the way the wind shifted, the brittle hush of the air. But this storm wasn't just snow and sky. It was something heavier, something waiting. He could feel it pressing against the door, in the pit of his stomach, in the silence between each word he and Olivia hadn't said since Talbot had come and gone. But they both knew he'd return. When the knock came just before dusk, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was certain. Entitled. The same as before. James didn't look at Olivia. He didn't need to. He opened the door. Talbot stood there, as if summoned by the wind, his coat dusted in snow, his gloves removed and tucked beneath one arm, like he meant to stay a while. Behind him, his horse stood tethered, flanks quivering from a cold, steam rising in harsh clouds from its nostrils. Evening, Talbot said, stepping inside uninvited. James didn't stop him this time. He moved aside, not as permission, but as measure. He was not afraid. But he was listening. Olivia stood from her chair. The shirt she'd been mending slipped to the floor, forgotten. Her hands clenched at her sides, but she didn't retreat. Talbot removed his hat slowly, eyes scanning the cabin as if taking inventory of what had changed. His gaze lingered on the cot in the corner, on the folded blanket at its edge, on the place where Olivia had made a space for herself. Something flickered in his expression, possessiveness, maybe, or disappointment. "This is cozy," he said. "Rustic. You always did like simple things." Olivia didn't respond. He stepped closer, still wearing that half-smile, the one that had once charmed boarding-house keepers and shop clerks alike. "I came to talk," he said, civilly. James remained near the stove, quiet, watchful. A pot of stew bubbled low behind him. He didn't offer a bowl. "I understand," Talbot said, turning back to Olivia, "that you've been confused. I take some blame for that. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I should have been gentler." His voice had the polish of a man used to speaking for others. Olivia didn't interrupt. "I've given it thought," he continued, "and I'm willing to start over. Forget this detour. Bring you home. You'll have your place again. Your dresses. Your piano. You won't have to stitch old shirts for some widower out in the hills." She flinched then, not from his words, but from the assumption behind them. James moved slightly, his fingers resting on the edge of the stove, calm but poised. Olivia took a breath. It came out slow, trembling. But when she spoke, her voice was clear. "I don't want your piano." Talbot blinked. "What?" "I don't want your dresses. Or your house. Or the way you talk to me, like I'm something you bought." The air between them thinned. "You're tired," Talbot said. "You've been in this place too long. You forgot what comfort feels like." Olivia shook her head. "I didn't forget. I just stopped believing it had to come with bruises." Talbot's face changed then. Something broke through the charm. Not rage, not yet. Just confusion. The slow realization that the control he thought he'd held had slipped. "I never hit you," he said sharply. "Not really. You're exaggerating. You don't have to use fists to hurt someone." Silence fell. Talbot looked toward James then, as if for backup, but found only steady eyes. "You going to let her say these things?" Talbot asked. "When there's a contract in place, a promise made." James didn't answer immediately. He straightened from the stove, poured coffee into a tin cup, and handed it to Olivia. "She can say whatever's true," he said, "and she can decide where she goes." "She's mine," Talbot snapped louder now. "You think this backwoods hospitality gives you claim over her? I've got papers." "I don't care what you've got," James said evenly. "You want to take her, ask her. Not me." "She doesn't know what she wants," Talbot muttered. "She never did." Olivia stepped forward. The coffee in her hand didn't spill. "I do now," she said. "I didn't before, when I thought I had to be grateful for a man noticing me. When I thought surviving meant saying yes. But I know now." Talbot stared at her like she was a stranger. She stood straighter than he remembered, spoke with a steadiness he didn't recognize. Whatever had lived in her eyes before, fear, uncertainty, had been replaced with something still and rooted. "I came to get you," he said quietly. "To make things right. You came to reclaim something that doesn't belong to you." The words landed like stones. James stepped between them then, not in defense, not in rescue, but in support. Silent, grounded. Talbot's hand twitched toward his coat. James noticed. So did Olivia. "Don't," James said, voice flat. Talbot hesitated. His face twisted with something like embarrassment, or maybe resentment. "I could bring the sheriff out here," he said. "Make trouble for both of you." "You could try," James replied. "But you won't." Talbot looked between them, and for the first time he seemed to understand that something irreversible had happened. That the woman who'd once answered his beck and call now stood beside another man, not as possession, but as person. "You'll regret this," he said again, but it sounded emptier now. Olivia turned away, not in retreat, but in dismissal. "I already did," she said softly, "but not anymore." James opened the door. Talbot stared a moment longer, then stepped out. Snow lashed across his face as he mounted his horse. He didn't look back. James shut the door against the cold. Olivia sat down at the table, setting the coffee gently beside her. Her hand shook then, not from fear, but from release. He sat across from her. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, she looked at him. "Thank you." He nodded. "Wasn't mine to give. Just stood with you." She looked down at her hands, then at the shirt she dropped. "You don't owe me anything," James said, reading the question she hadn't asked. "You can go. You're free." She studied the fabric in her hands, ran her thumb along the seam she'd mended. "I don't want to go," she said. And just like that, something shifted. Not loud, not sudden, just the quiet turning of a page. James stood, took her empty cup, and refilled it. When he set it down again, he didn't speak, just sat back in his chair like he had every night for months, and waited for the fire to settle. The wind still howled outside, but it no longer sounded like a threat. And when Olivia picked up the shirt again and threaded her needle, her hands were steady. The wind screamed through the cottonwoods that lined the ridge, their skeletal limbs shuddering beneath the weight of ice and sky. All night it had howled like an old pain, dragging snow in great sweeping arcs across the hills, trying to erase what lay below. But by morning, the world stood still again. The storm had broken. James stepped onto the porch with a rifle slung over one shoulder and steam curling from the tin mug in his hand. The cold was deep, but he barely noticed. His eyes swept across the prairie, where snow blanketed the land like a secret too heavy to speak aloud. The path to the barn had disappeared. The fences were buried to their posts. But the sky at last was clear. Behind him, the door creaked open. Olivia stepped out, arms wrapped tight around her shawl, eyes squinting against the morning glare. Her cheeks were red from the warmth of the fire, her hair braided back the way she always wore it when she wanted her hands free. She said nothing at first, just stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. A quiet companion in a world slowly coming awake again. "I thought storms like that only came in books," she murmured. James took a sip from his mug. "They come here, too. Just less poetry about it." She smiled faintly and looked out over the land. Her breath fogged in the air, trailing off in small puffs before disappearing into nothing. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked, not needing to explain who she meant. James shook his head. "Not this time." "How do you know?" "Because you chose," he said simply. "That's the one thing men like him can't undo." Olivia looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were dry, skin cracked at the edges. But they were steady, strong. She hadn't trembled since the night she'd told Talbot no. She glanced at him. "Would you have shot him?" He met her gaze. "If I had to." She nodded slowly. "I believe that." James didn't answer. He didn't need to. They stood together in silence until the cold began to press into their bones. Later in the barn, Olivia worked beside him, helping to clear snow from the doors. The boards creaked under their weight, but held. The horses nickered from inside, restless but alive. Together, they hauled feed, checked hooves, worked in a rhythm that had become second nature. When they paused, she leaned against the beam, brushing sweat from her brow with her sleeve. Her breath came hard, her cheeks flushed from effort. He passed her the water canteen without a word, and she drank deeply, eyes closed. "Do you miss her?" she asked quietly, eyes still shut. James took a long breath before answering. "Every day," he said, "but it doesn't ache the same." Olivia opened her eyes. "Did you love her the way a man's supposed to love?" He didn't answer right away. The question wasn't a trap, it was a measure. "I loved her in the way I knew how," he said finally. "And I buried her with every piece of me that couldn't go on." Olivia looked away, her thumb brushing the worn edge of the canteen. "I wonder if anyone will ever say that about me," she said softly. "That I was loved rightly." James stepped closer. "I don't think love is about saying it. It's about the quiet things. Staying when you could leave. Listening when it's easier not to. Laying your grief beside someone else's and not asking them to move it." She swallowed hard, but didn't look at him. "I used to believe love looked like permission," she whispered. "Now I think it looks like a door that isn't locked." James nodded. I don't know what I can give you, she said after a long pause. I've got a past, a bruised name, and hands that can't seem to stay still. I don't need more than that, he said. And if you decide to leave tomorrow, I'll still be glad you were here today. The words hit her deeper than she expected. She turned her face away, but he saw the shimmer at the corner of her eye. By midday, the wind had calmed. The sky hung low and pale, but without menace. They worked together without speaking much, clearing the walk, stacking firewood, checking traps along the tree line. The land had a rhythm, and in it, their silence found music. That evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Olivia stood at the window, watching the last of the sun catch on the snowdrifts. The golden light washed over her features, softening the worry lines etched by too many miles, too many near mistakes. James watched her from a table, not trying to be discreet. She caught him looking and didn't look away. "What do you see?" she asked. "Someone who stayed." The quiet that followed was different than all the others. Not strained, not uncertain, just full. She walked to the hearth and retrieved a small tin box she'd placed on the mantel weeks ago. Inside, she kept the pieces that mattered: James's daughter's drawing, the wooden horse, the patchwork square, and now, the locket she'd worn the night he found her. She opened it for the first time in his presence and showed him what lay inside. A pressed flower, long dried. A piece of blue ribbon. A name scrawled on the inside lid: Olivia May Talbot. She stared at it, then looked at James. "I think it's time I changed that." He said nothing, just nodded slowly. That night, as the wind curled against the windows and the fire crackled low, she reached for his hand. "I was waiting for someone to save me," she said. "But I didn't need saving. I just needed space to remember who I was." James didn't answer, just held her hand tighter. In the morning, they rode into town. Sundown Ridge was quieter than usual, still blanketed in white. A few shopkeepers shoveled walkways. A boy chased a chicken down the lane. No one paid them much attention. They dismounted in front of the post office, where Olivia pulled a letter from her satchel. Inside, the clerk looked up, startled by the sight of him. She stepped forward, slid the letter across the counter. "I'd like to cancel an arrangement," she said, calm but clear. "Olivia May Talbot is no longer in need of correspondence." The clerk blinked. "Is that legal?" Olivia smiled faintly. "Doesn't matter." Back outside, James helped her onto the wagon. They sat side by side, reins loose in his hands. As they turned the bend out of town, Olivia leaned into him, just slightly. "You never asked me what I wanted," she said. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She looked out at the hills. "I want to stay. Not as a guest. Not as something rescued. Just me." James nodded. "Then we'll make room." The wagon wheels creaked over frozen ruts, the sound folding into the hush of the land. When they reached the cabin, she didn't wait for him to help her down. She walked straight to the front door, opened it, and stepped inside like she belonged. That night, she pulled the cot apart, folded the blanket, carried the pillow to the bedroom she hadn't yet entered. James stood in the doorway, watching her. "You sure?" he asked. She turned. "I'm choosing this." He nodded. "Then I am too." She stepped into him, arms sliding around his waist. He held her like a man holding something he never expected to find again. No promises, no vows, just presence. And when morning came, with sunlight flooding the cabin and the snow outside beginning to melt in earnest, Olivia stood in the kitchen, stirring coffee, humming a low, wordless tune. James came in behind her, wrapped his arms around her middle, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "You always hum when you're at peace," he murmured. She smiled. "Or when I remember I'm allowed to be." And somewhere outside, the last breath of winter sighed through the trees, less like an ending, more like a benediction.